Welcome back to the Start Woodworking Series here at Worth the Effort. This was going to be the second class in the series. The first where we built an entire workbench, and in the second one I was going over the small set of hand tools we were using and the one power tool we'll be using, the bandsaw. And then we were going to do a small project where we took the most complex tool, the bandsaw, and the simplest tool, a knife, and we did a little grain direction exercise. But when I was editing it all together, I kind of discovered, because this was the only power tool we were going to be using in this series, and I have to assume that the people watching this video might be a little bit new to the craft, there was a lot more here I needed to go over concerning the physics, the characteristics, all that kind of stuff of the bandsaw, which will affect how you can safely use it. So I decided to break out that and make it a beginner's guide to the bandsaw, which meant that this second class ended up being 3 parts. An introduction to all the tools we will be using, the beginner's guide, and the really cool project that will kind of refine your knowledge about grain direction. So, welcome to the second part of the second class. I know it's kind of confusing, which is a beginner's guide to the bandsaw. Now, in my mind, a bandsaw is a brute force instrument. It's a very versatile brute force instrument, and that's why I use it so much. But there's nothing that this tool does that couldn't be accomplished with a simpler, more elegant, and probably less expensive hand tool. But the fact that you can put even a 1/3, 1/2, 3/4 horsepower motor on this one will consistently saw for all day long without breaking a sweat. Me, on the other hand, in this shape, I'll break a sweat. Even if my saws are tuned to their best effort, it is some body motion. And the fact that I can isolate the muscle power and more focus on the finesse means I can save myself a lot of time on the aftermath of the work here. Meaning refining it with my hand planes, my chisels, my other bench saws, and that kind of stuff. Let this thing do the brute force work. Now, the project we're going to be making today is a simple spatula. You can use the same exact techniques to make a butter knife, a back scratcher, a miniature frat boy paddle, whatever. It's the same techniques, but it's a very good way of learning both the skills using on the bandsaw and the skills with the knife. But first, before we do that, let's talk about the bandsaw a little bit more. Now, to be up front with y'all, when I was planning for this particular series, I did approach Rikon about borrowing this particular 10-inch model bandsaw. For the simple reason, I didn't think it would be that relatable to use my professional caliber 14-inch bandsaw for a lot of different things. I didn't want people to think that what they could afford, what they could buy, wouldn't be able to do the same amount of work. It was a relatability factor. And they were nice enough to provide this to me for this particular series. And the reason why I chose this particular model, it's a 10-incher, and that whole class is very friendly to the DIY crowd, because you could bolt it to the side of your workbench so it won't take up a lot more extra space in your workshop, or move it around. It is somewhat portable, being a benchtop model. But this one had a lot of bells and features to it that might be relatable to people wanting to upgrade later on down the road. So I could offer some explanation of what can happen so that y'all can make an informed decision of what kind of bandsaw you want. I'm not going to talk specifically about this model from here on out. I'm just using this as an example of features I like, features that do certain things, and attributes that might benefit you in just about any kind of bandsaw you buy. Now, obviously, a bandsaw gets its name because it uses a band of metal to cut stuff. I did talk about the different types of teeth that you can get on different bands for different purposes in that very first episode of my prerequisite course. Some of them are going to be more cross-cut based, some of them are going to be dedicated to rip cutting. Me personally, I get a very general blade because I don't like swapping out blades. There are a lot of people that have blades that are dedicated, okay, I'm only going to cut straight stuff with it. And that is a perfectly acceptable means, because when you start cutting curves, you generally wear one side of the tooth or another side of the tooth more, so that it makes cutting straight stuff a little bit more difficult. And I'm going to show y'all some techniques that probably aren't recommended if you're wanting to maintain the perfectly tuned bandsaw blade, because we're doing stuff that might bend the tooth a little bit. But once again, my thinking is this is a brute force machine. It is going to give you a rough cut. Very rarely is this going to be the last tool that touches any fibers that you're actually putting into your project. So if it's a little bit wavy, a little bit random, I'm not really that concerned with it personally. Now, bandsaws are oftentimes rated by their horsepower and size. This particular one is a 10-inch bandsaw, meaning the wheel itself has a 10-inch diameter. It runs, I believe, a half horsepower motor that runs about 1750 RPMs, rotations per minute. Now, some bandsaws do have multiple gears. This one does, where you can change the gears down on the belt on the bottom wheel, and that will speed it up. And that makes it a little bit easier if you're using your bandsaw to cut metals and plastics and stuff like that. Obviously, you have to use a different kind of blade for that kind of stuff. But it seems to be that the combination of wheel and motor affects how it's going to perform, because I know a lot of very old machines. Now, professional machines, they'll go up to 1 horsepower, which is like what I have on my bandsaw, 2, 3, 5 horsepower motors. But a lot of times they need that motor because of the wheels. And it seems to be a combination of horsepower and wheel weight that affects how a bandsaw is going to perform. You can have a higher horsepower motor and a lower weight wheel, and it will have the same amount of momentum to cut through the work. But if you have a low horsepower motor that it takes a long time to spin up, but it's spinning a real heavy wheel, well then as you're cutting through, the motor is actually working a little bit less because the wheel has a lot of momentum, so it doesn't have to be as high horsepower. Now, a lot of these 10-inch bandsaws, they use aluminum wheels simply because it is a weight savings. And a lot of times you can tell it is because they are not magnetic, and they tend to add weights to balance them. Iron wheels, which are the other common style you will see generally on the bigger bandsaws, the 12, 14 on up kind of bandsaws, most of the time they balance the wheel by removing metal on the backside. Do it on the backside just because they don't like to see those little pinholes, and they just drill a little bit of metal off until it's fully balanced. But if you can get a bandsaw that has a lot of mass in the wheel, it will cut more easily, more efficiently, and if it is fully balanced, it will smooth the entire process out. Because once again, something in motion tends to stay in motion, and the wheel has a lot of gyroscoping effect that will reduce vibration if it's balanced. Also, whenever you start doing a lot of research on these kinds of tools, you will hear a lot of people talking about coplanar bandsaw wheels. And what that means is the bottom wheel and the top wheel are completely in line this way and that way so that they can rotate evenly. I'm going to tell you, I don't believe that's that big an issue. As long as the bottom wheel is true with the front as far as spinning this way kind of action, which they come from the factory that way. I personally would not touch the bottom wheel if you're buying a new machine. If it is off, send it back and have them do it. If you're totally disassembling and restoring a vintage machine, you're going to have to set it up initially to get it perfectly in line. And that takes a lot of fiddling and math, and you can do it with 2x4s and that kind of stuff, but it's a big hassle. Really, the only thing as a beginning new woodworker, if you're buying a decent machine, is worrying about the top wheel, because it is designed to rotate back and forth to center the blade on the wheel. And if you think about that, if you're designed to move the top wheel this way and that way, well, you're changing coplanar all the time, and these things are not designed to have the bottom wheel adjusted, so why worry about it that much? Now that's going to be confusing to a lot of people. So how can you tell if your bandsaw wheels are out of alignment? Well, if you adjust the only wheel you're supposed to be adjusting and you get your blade tracking exactly where it's supposed to be, well, if once you get the top wheel adjusted the way it should be, if the blade is untracking in an unsafe manner, meaning the teeth are maybe hanging off the front section of it, or the back of the blade is hanging off the back and on the metal, well, then you know that this isn't right. And either if it's a new bandsaw, send it back. They should have had that ready from the factory. If it's something that you've restored, or it's a vintage machine that somebody else might have been messing with, if you don't trust yourself, have a mechanic look at it. This isn't a huge time adjustment for them, because they have the experience and the tools, and they can get it dialed in. And once this bottom wheel is dialed in, you pretty much won't have to touch it for the life of the machine, unless you totally disassemble and restore it again, 50 years from now. The only maintenance I could see you might have to do, 5-10 years down the road, if you're using your machine a whole bunch, is, you might have to replace bearings. But bandsaws are such generic machines. These are fairly generic bearings that you can get just about anywhere fairly inexpensively. Take it to the machine shop, they can press them out, press them in, or you can do that yourself, and then just put it back on. But top or bottom, you shouldn't have to change the adjustments when you do that. The other thing you might swap out is the rubber material that goes around the wheel, and that is somewhat of a wear item, but it wears extremely slow. I know on my 14-inch bandsaw, I've only had to replace those once in the 15 years Dad and I have owned that machine, so it's not that big a deal. A lot of us nowadays are swapping it out to polyurethane or some kind of urethane wheel, where the old ones were rubber, and the rubber ones tended to wear out more. Plus the fact that you can get colors, which a black wheel with this metal blade, sometimes it's hard to see where it's tracking, but if you get a bright colored wheel, it makes it a lot easier to see where the blade is tracking. Now, what do I mean by tracking? Well, most bandsaws have a range of widths that the saws can handle. These being 10-inch bandsaws, most commonly they will allow you to do up 1/8 to about a 1/2 inch blade. And how they come up with that measurement is how wide a blade can fit on there. So the manufacturer will tell you to center whatever blade you want on the tire. Here's a set of the teeth right there, and that way they can get the biggest size blade on that wheel. And that has kind of been a traditional way people have been setting it up. I will tell you, whenever I set it up like this, I've always had issues with reliably cutting straight lines and controlling the blade. Alex Snodgrass, if you want to really dive deep in this, is pretty much the expert in this area right now. Every generation seems to have a new person that advocates new stuff. Well, he advocates a very traditional way of doing it, and that's utilizing the crown to control how a blade moves. And what he would do is a bandsaw blade, that they have teeth, kind of like that, and the bottom of the blade is the gullet. That right there is the gullet. So if you were to put the gullet on the center of the wheel, so that the teeth are kind of coming off the wheel a little bit, well, obviously you can't get as big a blade on the wheel, because it would be hanging off. So if you want your blade to track where the crown is anchoring the center of the blade right about there, really close to the edge, well, then you just understand you're never going to be able to reach your maximum width blade. But why would you want the crown anchoring there? Well, here's the thing about bandsaw blades. This might be a shocker to you. They're designed to bend, so that when they go around the wheels, they can bend around the wheels. So it can bend in this direction quite easily, and it can actually twist a little bit. What it doesn't like doing is bending this way, because the blade is fairly thin, so this action is fairly easy. But if you're flexing it this way, that puts a lot of pressure on it. But because it is designed to bend, it bends. So if you were to have a round crown on your wheel, and you were to place your blade flat on that crown where it's in the middle, well, it's going to flex in both directions. Okay? So as you're feeding wood into the blade, if it's moving, you have a lot harder time controlling it. But if you were to move it to the back of the crown, well, the back of the blade will still flex all it wants back and forth, but the front, because it's so much farther, it can't move that much. So the front, the cutting teeth aren't going to be moving left and right or changing their angles that much if you have them over the crown versus in the middle. Does that make sense? It's one of those deals where I used to set up my bandsaw probably for a decade exactly like the manufacturers told me to. Put the blade in the center of the wheel. Then when you go through all these things, I got to adjust for drift, I got to do all this kind of stuff, I'm getting bows, it's curving on me, I'm having trouble controlling it, every blade seems to act differently. There's lots of things that you will see when you're going into forums. How do I solve this problem? And it's one of those problems. But whenever I started moving that center to where the gullets would, a lot of those issues went away, or they got so reduced that I wasn't really concerned with them that much anymore. So when we're talking about tracking a blade, you can decide. You can either put it in the center, or you can maybe move it slightly back so that the gullets are in the center and enjoy some benefits there. My opinion, I think that is the better way of doing it, but I will tell you, manufacturers, even Rikon, tell you to put it in the center of the blade. And personally, I kind of think it might be a marketing thing so that they can advertise you can put the wider blade on it. Now, why would blade width be important? Well, you will see a lot of industrial machines. They have really wide, thick blades on them, and a lot of people that have their own personal bandsaws in a small shop, they want a 1-inch thick or 3/4 inch wide blade. And the key thing is, the idea is it cuts straighter. But in reality, all it is the wider the blade, the more tension you can put on it. In fact, the settings on these machines, they have a scale that when you have a wider blade, you can torque down on the tensioning system to a higher foot-pound ratio. If you think about it, whether you have a 1/8 inch blade or a 1/2 inch blade, well, the teeth are only cutting in the very tip of it. The whole back of the blade is just there for support. And obviously the welds and the tension of a narrow blade cannot handle as much torque or pressure as a more metal, thicker blade. So you typically don't put as much tension tightening up the blade in between the top and bottom wheels when you have a narrower blade. Thus, the blade itself can kind of deflect a little bit more on its own. It can wander a little bit in the cut. You can get bowed resaws, that kind of stuff. And yes, there are a lot of other factors as far as teeth count, the gullet size, whether it's a skip tooth, random tooth, TPI. But for the most part, the thicker the blade, the more tension you can put on it, and the more force you can the more you can force it to stay straight in the cut. But to me, if you just have a simple sharp blade, it'll cut straight on you. And these things are inexpensive enough. I did just go by and get what I used to use on my 10-inch blade, a 1/8 inch high tooth count blade for fine scrolling work. And this is really detail work. I very rarely use this blade. And then a general purpose 3/8 inch, I think it's a 4 TPI with a skip tooth, which means there's a little bit more space in between the teeth, but the gullet is more dense tooth pattern. And that's what I use for everything. Same goes with my large bandsaw. I would typically use a 3/8 or a 1/2 inch blade on that one, and it really just depends upon what the guy I get the blades from has in stock, because sometimes he runs low on 3/8. And I will use that for my green bowl turning, for fine woodworking, all that kind of stuff, because I just replace them often enough that the dullness doesn't affect the cut. And that's what the higher tension allows you to do, is if the blade wants to go this way, but you can force it back with that higher tension, you can get the straighter cut longer. Now, blades themselves, as I said, for this 1/8, for this 10-inch saw, I went ahead and got a fine tooth blade, 1/8 thick, and this will allow me to do tight curves and stuff like that. And this is good for small, like bandsaw boxes and stuff. But I go to a machine shop that services woodworking equipment here in Austin, Texas, Weatherford's, and they make my blades. So they basically buy a spool of this stuff a couple miles long, and then as customers want it, they pull out the length that they want, they cut it, and then they weld it themselves. So these blades right here are like $7 or $8 for me. The ones I get for my 14-inch one that I've been using for all these years, same exact setup. They weld it up for me. There's the weld right there. And these run me about 13 bucks, no matter just about any size I could get that would fit on my 14-inch bandsaw. So to me, this is a disposable item. You could technically resharpen them, but I can't imagine the amount of time you would spend on this. The other thing, and it's kind of a huge subject matter whenever you start talking bandsaws, is the teeth. And here's a general rule of thumb I go by. I like to have as wide a gullet, meaning the distance between one tooth and another, as I can get when I'm turning green wood, and I do a lot of wood turning. So on my 14-incher, I typically use what they call a skip tooth design, which means that they cut each tooth as if they are skipping the one in the middle. So this one right here, I believe, is a 3 teeth per inch tooth, but the actual distance up on the tooth isn't as much, and that allows it to be a little bit stronger. It just increases the space for the sawdust to be in there, because once the gullet is filled with sawdust, it stops cutting. And if you're cutting really deeply a large section of wood, that one tooth is cutting all that way down. So if it fills up the cut before it's reached the exit point, well, then all of a sudden it starts bending out and creating heat, and lots of bad things happen. You want it to be able to scrape its way all the way down, and right below where it exits the wood, that's when that gullet is full. The other general rule is the type of material you use. This 3/4 inch board right here, you want to make sure that you have at least 3 teeth in that board at all times. If you have only 2 teeth in that board, it's going to get a lot rougher material. You'll get some vibration-induced kind of scalloping, and you won't have as much control. If you can make sure you have at least 3 teeth in the board, you're going to be just fine. Again, there are a lot of different bandsaw blades out there that are marketed towards the woodworkers. Variable teeth, variable hooks, variable bimetals, all that kind of stuff. You can get carbide ones on there. All those features are nice, and they will enhance the quality of the cut. I'm never going to deny that. I have seen some extremely smooth cuts coming off of a carbide tip random tooth blade. But it's also one of those things that even after a smooth cut, the woodworker refined it with his tools before he jointed stuff up. So, you know, back in my mind, I'm thinking, you spent all that money on a blade, and you're still refining it after the fact, just like I do when I spend, you know, $7 to $10 on a blade. I'm doing the same. We're doing the same amount of work and getting the same amount of results, and I can replace my blade quite often. Whereas if you spent, you know, $125 on a blade or something like that, the kinds that you send off to get resharpened, well, what happens if you bend a tooth or something like that? Which happens all the time when you are cutting curves, because you might be putting more pressure on one side of the blade than the other. Which brings me to how tight a diameter can any given blade cut. So let's pretend we have the maximum size you can fit on my 10-inch bandsaw, a 1/2 inch blade, and then I have my 1/8 inch blade. Well, why can this one turn a tighter radius than this one? Well, you have the blade, and then you have the teeth, and the teeth have set on them. Now, if you get a very coarse blade, a lot of times they have a little bit more set, which strangely allows you to turn a tighter curve, because the set cuts into the wood a little bit wider than the blade itself. It's the back of the blade that's the limiting factor in your curve, because if you are trying to cut a curve, this inside corner is going to touch the middle of the blade and exit that way. The outside corner is going to come around here and it's going to touch the back of the blade. That is the tightest radius you can cut. Right like that. Where it's touching the tooth, the back of the blade, and then the center of the blade. Anything more than that, you're just twisting the blade and it's not cutting the actual curve. Whereas if you look at a narrow blade, well, you can get that same curve and it's a much tighter radius. Can y'all see that? So whenever I'm cutting a curve, strangely, I'm focusing more on the back of the blade than the front of the blade to determine what I can do. But as I said earlier, I am not a fan of swapping blades out for individual cuts. So I have tricks that I use all the time to cut tighter boards. It's also why I only use a 3/8 inch blade for most of my work, even when I'm on the bigger 14-inch professional saw. So, since we're talking about blades, let's go ahead and change the blade on this one. This one has the factory blade on it, and the only thing I've cut on this one is when I first got it, I turned it on and cut a little 2x4 just because I wanted to cut something. Typically, the factory blades that come on these kind of tools are crap. But keep it as a backup, because you will always break a blade whenever you really need to make a cut. So having this as a backup, you can at least make the cuts, get the work done. Now, pretty much all bandsaws have some kind of tensioning knob where you can fine-tune the adjustments. Knob up top, or a knob attached to a mechanism in the center of it. All this thing does is a screw that raises and lowers that top wheel to add or reduce tensioning. And if that's all you have, you're going to have to sit here and crank on this until you can lower that wheel enough so that you can take the blade off. A lot of modern day higher end saws have a quick release mechanism. Now, this is a saw my dad got up in Wisconsin, and when he moved down here, for a few months we combined shops. I had a 12-inch saw and he had this 14-incher with a riser block, which gives you a little bit more clearance, and we turn a lot of bowls, so we needed that amount of material to do logs and stuff like that. So this was a benefit. So what I did was I sold my 12-inchers and bought a lot of stuff to hop this one up. One of them being a quick release setup from Carter Tools. And FYI, they have a little knob, but I always put my hearing protector on here because when it's released, obviously it's not used. So before I come over here and use it, I'm putting my hearing protection on. It tells me that it's released. And basically what you do is you lift it up, and that puts tension on it. Lower it, it releases a little bit of tension. Lower it all the way down, it releases all the tension, and you can take the blade off. Really good benefit for the durability of your saw if you don't use it a lot. Because what happens is that pressure on the rubber wheels or the nylon or whatever that material is, wheels, well, it will kind of oblong those over time, putting them out of balance and out of round, so you'll get this rum, 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 rum. If you reduce the pressure on them, it doesn't do that one. Now, in an industrial setting, that's not a very big deal because they're constantly being used. They might sit overnight, but the next day they're being used and it rests in a different spot, and it just kind of averages out over time. But for bandsaws that are DIY, you might use it once a month or once on the weekend. It's really nice to detension the blade, even if it means you just got to crank on this thing for a minute or two and wear your wrist out. Now that detensioning setup is making its way down into the lower level bandsaws, and it is a feature that it'll make your life a lot easier if you can go ahead and get. But the thing is, it makes your life easier if you're replacing the same blade every single time. For example, I use that 3/8 inch all the time on that saw, so I can do make all these settings very consistent, and all I need to do is detension it and retension it, even when I'm swapping it out from an old dull blade to a new sharp blade. But if you're going from 1/8 inch to 3/8 inch to 1/2 inch and stuff like that, it's less a convenience because you're going to have to adjust the tension on that blade. Remember me talking about that earlier. So this machine does have a quick release, but that quick release right there is more just slightly lowering it for when it isn't in storage. It also does lower the tension enough that you can move the blade on and off for when you are swapping them out. Now, no matter what kind of bandsaw you have, you're going to have a table. It's going to be made out of either iron, stamped steel, or sometimes aluminum. Preference is for iron because it's a lot heavier and it will dampen vibration quite a bit. But they've got to split it in half in order to just get the blade out. And when they do that one, they generally have some kind of pin right there that will lock these two sides together. Unfortunately, I lost mine, and these do move over time. I am lucky in that when you run your finger over, you can tell that this back side is slightly lower than this front side. So as things move over, it's going down and it's not catching on that one. I got lucky on that one. I should go ahead and find that pin right there to bring them back into line. But that dividing of the table, it either comes out to the side or the front, and those have their pluses and minuses. My personal opinion, I like it coming out on the side because I don't have to remove the fence in order to get it off. The downside is you have to wrangle it around a lot of these parts on the top and bottom, which sometimes you bang them and bend the teeth and stuff like that. And it's just a lot more difficult to get it to turn sideways behind all the safety guards. If you had the slot coming straight out here, it's a lot easier to do. But when it does come out the front, you're going to have to remove whatever kind of fence you have installed to do it. But most of the time it only takes a few turns of a couple of knobs. It's not that big a deal. And because the slot's right there, you're probably going to have some kind of pin. This pin takes longer to remove than the fence does. And then once it's detensioned, it's a simple matter of pulling it straight off and through your guards. Very simple. When the slot is moving here, you end up having to bend it around the fence, then pivoting around, getting it through the bearings and past these guards, because you can see it's not going to come out this way, so you first have to get it out and then spin it, and it's just a lot more cumbersome to work it around to get it to come out that front side in order to have a table design where you don't have to remove the fence. You're going to want to fold up the blade. Now this seems like black magic to a lot of people, and there are a lot of different ways of doing it. Here's the way I do it. Hold your hands up like machine gunning. Sit right in the middle. Turn this hand upside down, and then you're going to straighten this hand up and turn this one upside down, and it's just kind of one motion. Boom. There you go. No big deal. To undo it, you kind of hold it out from you, you find the two different sections, and then just kind of reverse the process. Now the other way is, what I like to do is just kind of go throw it out on the grass and it'll pop out. I wouldn't recommend it on the concrete or in the shop because it's going to hang on something. But if you have something soft, piece of cardboard you can put down, just throw it out and it'll go bing. It's kind of fun. So I am going to put the 3/8 inch blade on. Hook the blade over the bottom first. I find easiest. Get it past all the security guards. There we go. Then lay it down. In its loose state, you should be able to just kind of position it over there, but you might have to put it in between the guards. Once it's there, just retighten it back up. Now notice when I retighten the quick release setup on this one, because it's a different size blade, perhaps the guy that I had him cut, maybe he cut it 1/4 or 1/8 of an inch longer than the other ones. I'm now going to have to adjust it with the knob to raise it up until it gets into the right tension. So since it's going to be a totally different blade, different diameter geometry blade, I will go ahead and loosen up all my guides, front, top, and bottom. Then make sure that the bar is in the fully tensioned position. Then I'm going to use the knob that's up top that raises this down. This could be up top or on another bar like on that Delta 14-inch knockoff I have. And everybody seems to have a different method. My initial method is I will come over here and I will press on this one. And when it takes me enough pressure that my fingernail turns white, I will say that's good enough at this point in time. I'm going to refine that pressure later on. And then it's a matter of rotating this around until I can get it tracking where I want. Now what's cool about a lot of saws is they've started putting these windows so it's easier to see the blade, plus the fact that you have a light colored wheel, you can determine your tracking fairly easily. Then on the side of the wheel, over here, you generally have some kind of knob that will move. Well, your wheel is attached to the frame via this bracket, and this bracket pivots up here. So that screw that we're twisting is actually pushing this bottom of this bracket this way, and that adjusts the angle of the wheel. Now, bandsaws all have different kinds of mechanisms, but it all seems to be based off the same principle that you're pushing on the bracket that attaches the wheel to the frame. So we loosen whatever kind of lock screw I have. On my Delta, I need a little wrench to do that one, and then you can move this backward and forward to progress that plate in and out. So I will slowly start spinning the wheel with my hand and adjust that wheel in and out until I get my tracking the way I want it to be, which for me, that's positioning the gullets slightly in front of the crown. And then tighten that locking wheel back up, because this will move if it doesn't have that done, and now throw off your tracking. At which point I will lock it up, I will plug it in, and I will turn it on. Please remember, I have not done any adjustments here. I've made all the adjusters totally away from the blade. I want the blade to spin completely unobstructed. I'm also going to raise the guard all the way up. Stand back, turn it on. Now what I'm looking for is a flutter in the blade. Can you see how the blade is kind of dancing back and forth? That is ever so slightly too loose. So what I'll do is I will turn it off. I will tighten it up a half turn. I will turn it back on again, each time standing back. The flutter is almost gone now. Turn it off, let it stop. Give it a half turn or a third turn this time. Turn it back on. So now when you see I turn it on, it's pretty solid. That to me is the perfect tension. It's loose enough that if the blade needs to move around because I'm turning too tightly, or it needs to adjust, the tail end needs to fishtail to stay in the curve to adjust for drift, it can do that. Any tighter than that, it's not going to make it any more stable. All it's going to do is add stress to the blade. So now put the table pin back in before you lose it. Put on the table fence. FYI, if you have an aluminum table fence, sand smooth these edges, because they come from the factory. They were just sliced. They were really, really sharp. You'll notice I have a couple cuts right there just from bumping into it. So just take some sandpaper to it. This particular one was aluminum, but you can do that to steel. Okay, and now everything is tensioned up. Everything's tensioned up. We now adjust our bearings. Now the only bearing that is truly critical is the one that is bracing behind the blade right here. You want the blade to move ever so slightly on the wheels when you put pressure on it and then touch that blade. You do not want there to be this curve right here of the blade bending as you put pressure on it, because that's the direction a bandsaw blade doesn't want to move. That will snap a blade. By having the back bearing underneath the table and on top of the table, putting a little bit of pressure right there so that it can't move too far back, will maintain not only the accuracy of your cut but the life of your blade. The two side ones, I will admit, I typically run a little bit looser than most people, but that again is my attitude towards the bandsaw, and that is a rough cutting tool. It is a brute force tool for me. I'm not looking for ultimate precision, though I tend to get it just because of the way I use I move the wood over the blade. So the first thing we want to do is set the back of the blade. Now every single bandsaw I've owned a 10-incher, my first one was a 10-incher, I then bought a 12-inch Craftsman, and then I have this jet right here. They all work off of this principle where you have some kind of hex key to loosen it up. FYI, if that's the kind, go ahead and buy an X key, put a magnet on your bandsaw and just leave it there. And then you have these little pinch things right here. You kind of pinch them in to move them back and forth. So what you will do is you'll either put a business card or something in between them, or what I would do is I would touch it to the blade and then pull it back a little bit, and then you have to tighten it up. Now this is one of those weird things you're going to learn with your bandsaw. See how I'm tightening by rotating it? Well, when you do that one, it typically, when it seats, it'll move one way or the other. Mine typically move this way. So whenever I am tightening this one up, I have it a little bit looser on this side, then I tighten it up and it tightens up just a tad bit over here. On this side, I'll actually touch it to the blade, and when I tighten it up, it moves slightly off. So you'll kind of figure out how your bandsaw works. The coolest ones I've ever seen were these toolless ones where the bearing was in an offset thing. So you basically loosened it up and you could rotate the bearing around and it would kind of come in closer, and then you tighten it up and it locked it down. Really cool toolless setup. But once again, you can see I run my blade a little bit looser than most. This to me is just there to prevent it from getting wildly off track. Most of the straightness comes from proper feeding into the blade, which we will talk about later, and the proper tensioning of the tool. Now I wanted to show that one because this new setup is quite a bit different. You have these toolless ones, and these are on springs. So basically what you do is you kind of squeeze it down together so that both sides are touching, and then you just let up a little bit and tighten it. If you want to, you could put a business card on both sides, squeeze it in, tighten it out, and then remove those business cards and you'll have that gap. And that should be just enough so that, well, something's touching, so either the back bearing or a side bearing is moving. Oh, yep, that side bearing right there is moving, so it's a little bit too tight. So I will loosen that one up a little bit. So now when I rotate it, it's dead silent. The bearings, no matter if they are bearings, guide blocks, ice blocks, hunks of wood, no matter, their job is not to make the saw blade track straight. Their job is to keep it contained within the range you want. So ideally, they won't be touching the blade at all in normal use, with maybe the exception of the rear thrust bearing as you press it forward. Now, pressing forward is a great segue to my biggest frustration with the bandsaw. And yes, this thing frustrates me more than just about any other tool I own, but it is one of my most commonly used power tools. And that is keeping alignment. This 90-degree angle right there. Most of my stuff is rough cutting. I've said that over and over and again. But there are some things, like maybe the tenon of a Morrison tenon joint, that I want to just take those little sides off with a bandsaw, where I have to have it at 90 degrees. And every time I have to have it at 90 degrees, I need to adjust everything to get it to 90 degrees. For this reason, pressure. See the bed moving? The frame, the design of this stuff, it could be we have extension blocks in here that increases the distance. It could be the fact that every single bandsaw design has 2 pressure points and an open area. So when you put pressure on the blade, you are actually squeezing these 2 points together. Could be the fact that the only way they seem to mount these tabletops on most of the bandsaws that are available to the DIY person is either on a piece of sheet metal or it's anchoring off of a single point so that there's flex. So you could, if you aren't very careful in how you present the wood to it and you induce a little pressure one way or the other, it will change that angle. If you have the pressure of your wheel different from one blade to the other, it can change the angle. So if you can't really care about it, if it's within a couple of degrees, you're doing a rough cut, you're going back to the bandsaw, great and wonderful. But it always seems to be, because I end up doing a bunch of Morrison tenon joints when I do them, and I like to do the bandsaw for cutting the cheeks, that I have to be very careful my presentation of the wood and getting it aligned just perfectly with a square every single time. Now when you start getting up to the high dollar professional machines, I have noticed that tends to go away a little bit. It comes mainly down to how they mount the tables. So here's the issue. The adjustment mechanism for these tables, and this is very, very standardized. We have 2 locking wheels. One side and the other side have the same kind of adjuster. You loosen them up, then you have this circular mechanism that attaches to the table, the opposite circular mechanism that attaches to the bandsaw. So those will rotate kind of like that, which you kind of, if you need to get an exact angle, you're doing it with your hand pressure to line it up, lock it in here, and then lock it in here. And strangely, because there's different pressure points and it could be twisting ever so slightly right here before you lock it in, that can adjust it a degree or 2. You also have this mechanism right here that stops it at supposedly 90 degrees, so you can get a repeatable 90 degrees. That locks it down. I want you to think about this. You have an anchor point on the corner here, an anchor point here, and an anchor point here. You have a triangle on the corner of a square or rectangle. It's not centered. So can you see where the flex is coming from? You have leverage to the point where it's mounting here and it's not on all 4 corners. And they do this to create a stable so that you don't have to, well, if you have 3 legs, they will always be resting on something. If you have a 4th leg, one could be a little bit lower than the others, and then it would rock like that. 3 are always going to sit steady. But getting them to the exact angle you want them to be steady at is frustrating. Now I do know the higher end, more expensive ones, it's more like a trunnion system, like a table saw, which is a lot more rigid, but they're so heavy they need that trunnion system. Remember, this is like an iron plate right here. The bigger they are, the thicker they are, the heavier they are. So sometimes when you get to that size, you need the gears, the mechanism, stuff like that to be able to rotate it just because of its mass. And that adds to its stability. Now that was on a classic Delta knockoff style bandsaw. They may have been making those style forever. It's basically a giant iron C that connects the top wheel to the bottom wheel and creates rigidity, but it can still flex with the pressure, as I mentioned. I much prefer this more modern stamped steel design. Yes, I know they're a little bit less money to manufacture, a little bit lighter, all that kind of stuff, but the dust collection on these is so much better. Those iron C-style ones, I mean, there's no way to collect the dust very well because it's so open to the elements. At least this design, they can lock it in and control airflow over the blade through stuff to get as good a suction as you can on a bandsaw. Again, blades are out in the open, so it's never going to be perfect. But even This one has the same issue with the table. I mean, this one's a lot more rigid than the one I have, but it still flexes a little bit if you really get after it, so you're going to have to be careful, and that is because every single one of these stamped steel style models are mounted to the side. So if you go over and you find a table and it does flex quite a bit, look at the thickness of the steel they are using, because that's where all the flexion is, because this table right here is totally anchored here. It's not on both sides of the table. So you can see there's a lot of leverage if you were to press there. And if steel is thin enough, it's going to loosen up over time. It adds a little bit of flexion. So good quality models are going to have a whole bunch of ridges and such on the inside. And these ridges are designed not only to affect airflow, but also dramatically strengthen it up. That's why you have cross pieces going over here, because they're trying to strengthen up this plate of sheet metal. And when you're shopping for this style, you also want to look at the thickness of this square beam to make sure it is solid, because it's this beam right here that's preventing the whole section from flexing a little bit under the tension that you're putting on the bandsaw blade. Granted, you know, 1/2 inch, 3/8 inch, 1/8 inch, they're not going to be putting that much pressure on it. The other aspect around accuracy that frustrates me when you are going for ultimate accuracy on the bandsaw. Remember, it's a rough cutting tool, so you should probably be refining everything that comes off of it. But once again, those tenon cheeks, or if I'm resawing, fences on bandsaws forever have been crap. This one is, I hate it, because every single time you come over here, it might be a little bit different angle-wise to the bed. And we're only talking a few degrees, but those few degrees make a big difference when you're cutting a tenon cheek. You look back at my videos, a lot of times you will see me putting blue tape or a couple of layers of blue tape either on the top or the bottom. That is simply to get the angle perfect so that this fence is in line with this blade, which can't change because of the tension of the bandsaw, and is square to the table of the fence. But you look here, that ain't going to be accurate. You kind of get to the point where, okay, this side's always going to be down, I tighten it down, I check the blade, I check the fence, and there you go. A lot of it has to do with this type of fence, where it squeezes on both sides. I've never been a fan of that one. Most modern day table saws have like that Biedermeier fence that kind of squeezes on a bar on one side of the table, so you only have to adjust that side to get it perfectly. But I will say, in the modern era, with a lot of the latest bandsaws that are coming out, one of the biggest things that they are focusing their improvement efforts are on fences, because they are finding that a lot of us DIYers are using our our bandsaws as substitutes for table saws and that kind of stuff, where the fence accuracy really does enhance the experience at the tool. And some of the features I see are things like adjustable fences. You know, if you have a very tall fence and you want to make a thin cut, well, obviously if you've got your guard, still learning a new tool, guard all the way down, you can't have a very tall fence. It just doesn't work. It needs to be able to slip underneath the guard in order to get close to the blade to be used as a fence. Well, a lot of manufacturers nowadays are making their fences so that you can take them on and off and rotate them so that they can be either tall or short to get underneath the guard if it needs to be. So now you can resaw something a little bit closer to the blade, having a tall fence for registry purpose, which the one I have over there, a lot of times I will bolt a piece of plywood to make it taller, but it's just kind of nice having it from the factories. And this isn't common, I mean, this isn't unique to Rikon, though I haven't seen it on too many 10-inch bandsaws, but it's becoming more and more common, this multi-function fence design in bandsaws that are coming out, or auxiliary fences that you can buy for vintage bandsaws. Oh, and one thing, because this particular fence only mounts on this side, it doesn't have to go all the way across, so the fence itself doesn't have to go all the way across the bed. I do a lot of resawing and stuff like that, and sometimes when you're resawing thin stuff, it kind of moves on you or splits on you. Or how many of y'all have been resawing something and the tension on the backside causes the board to kind of do this action, so that as you get close to the blade, close to the end of the blade, it actually just splits the rest of the way, which can be kind of dangerous. Well, because they don't have, this particular model doesn't have a fence that has to anchor on both sides, you can actually bring the fence back all the way here to right at the blade. So as you're resawing something, if it needs to bend one way or the other, it has an open space to do it. It's not registering against the rest of the fence and thus affecting the blade drift or the blade bend or blade pressure. I've never played with something like this, but I'm kind of interested in doing that. But for the most part, when I am using a bandsaw, even when I'm making straight cuts, I'm not using a fence. I'm using my hands. I'm using my fingers. I'm using my body motion as I move it to control the feed of both the rate and the placement of the blade along the line. And I just find it easier doing that with my digits compared to something that's locked down that doesn't allow for some flexibility. And that's the kind of stuff we will be covering in the third episode of this second class in the Start Woodworking Series, because we will start talking about the actual use of the tool in addition to the use of the knife in order to play around with grain. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, learned a little bit about the bandsaw, so that when we approach it to learn techniques, you'll feel a little bit more confident in yourself and the tool. So y'all be safe, have fun, and see you in the third episode of this class. Oh, and if you're enjoying this series, please check out and down in the description for ways you can help subsidize this kind of effort for us. There's lots of ways you can patronize us, from buying some of my merchandise, the bowls I make, t-shirts, that kind of stuff, and even my Patreon page. Y'all be safe and have fun.